Hi, hello, the Publius FM show is back. Today we're talking electric cars and climate change, and energy efficiency, and transit, and zoning regulations, and electric cars again. I have recently received an email from Tesla reminding me that it's last few days to buy one of their vehicles and benefit from EV tax credit. I'm not buying as my car seems to be doing perfectly fine, but if you were about to buy a brand new electric car and you are eligible, better hurry up to benefit from that sweet $7,500 tax credit. In this episode, I will talk climate policy. Current administration seems to be pretty bad on climate on so many levels, actually remarkably bad. We went from neglect to almost active war against any pragmatic climate policy, from actively curbing biggest market environmental success of renewables development in Texas to various anti-public transport policies and general inefficiency due to trade wars and tariffs. Uh, I guess when someone who does care about global warming will get to be elected in few years, they will want to fix it. And their first intuitive thought would be to restore the electric car tax credit. But was it a good idea anyway? Does subsidizing electric cars really help us fight climate change, make air cleaner? What other policies should we pursue when we will be serious about addressing climate change again? If you are one of hardcore MAGA believers, I will not be trying to convince you that climate change is real. This may be for another time, for another episode. But for the rest of us, this conversation may be very important and very interesting since the EV tax credit is going away.
And it's gone.
But first things first, you really need to subscribe to this channel to get access to more content like this. Most of listeners of Publius FM are not subscribers. You subscribing means a lot to me and really helps this channel grow. Electric cars were benefiting from tax preference ever since Obama administration through simple tax credit of $7,500. This remained unchanged during first Trump presidency, even as the rest of tax code was given huge overhaul, but was revolutionized meaningfully during Biden presidency, and now it's going away. By the way, I believe that Biden reform made it worse, but before getting deeper into specifics, let's address the first elephant in the room. Are electric cars good for environment? Electric cars don't produce emissions in the same way as traditional cars, diesel or gasoline do, but they put demand on power grid, so if generating stations use fossil fuels, electric cars are indirectly responsible for these emissions. What's more, building electric cars requires more energy and minerals than traditional cars, so emissions tied to making an electric car are often higher than emissions related to manufacturing of a conventional vehicle. So, are electric cars a net positive or net negative for the society and environment, at least compared to cars that burn fossil fuels and produce climate warming emissions? Well, gasoline car operates by burning gasoline in its internal combustion engine. This reaction produces carbon dioxide and water vapor while releasing energy needed to turn the wheels. Most of that energy is lost to heat, yet some 15 to 25% is transferred to wheels for vehicle to move forward. This infographic from Yale Climate Connections visualizes it quite well. By comparison, an electric vehicle puts wheels in motion by putting electric current through coils and using principles of magnetism. Like with a gas car, electric car is not perfectly efficient in converting energy it consumes into kinetic energy of its motion, so about 11% of energy is lost, and some like 87 to 91% of its original energy gets to the wheels. As an electric car isn't producing its own electricity, that's unless it's equipped with solar panel of its own, its carbon footprint needs to include carbon footprint of electricity used to charge its batteries. in an area where grid is mostly powered with nuclear or renewable, this carbon footprint may be relatively low, while when coal or natural gas are in use, EV advantages over gas car may be way lower. Let me borrow this visualization from Driving Cleaner report based on EPA data. As you would notice, in areas where local grid depends on fossil fuels, implied carbon footprint of an electric car is equivalent to that of a gas car running at 42 miles per gallon, while in areas with cleaner power generation technology, we can yield equivalent of 100 miles per gallon or more for an electric car. Well, 42 mpg is still far better than average gas car, but you see that the difference between cleanest and dirtiest of local grid is fivefold, so big area of difference, big range of difference. Likewise, of course, to be fair, if we keep electric cars accountable for indirect emissions, we want to keep gas cars accountable for emission related to crude oil extraction, shipping, and refining, as well as distribution of gasoline or diesel fuel. And another question is, of course, manufacturing of the motor vehicle. Building a new car consumes resources and energy regardless if it's gas or electric. That's why the most environmentally friendly car, when we're taking into account its full life cycle and global impact, is always a used car, or even better, no car at all. And electric cars on average are heavier than gas cars. Most of that extra weight is tied to batteries, which are also mineral and energy intensive to manufacture. So let's compare total CO2 of electric car versus gas car over its entire life cycle. Here is a data from EPA outlining gas compared to electric. What it tells us is that manufacturing of an electric car indeed produces more greenhouse gases than manufacturing of a gas car. Notice, battery is added on top of manufacturing cost as a separate item, and producing electricity for it consumes even more energy. On the other hand, even with all of that included, electric car still produces less greenhouse gases per mile compared to a conventional vehicle. See left column for a gas car, right column for an EV. And also, crucially, most of where those greenhouse gas emissions are generated happens either overseas or in relatively controlled environments, while internal combustion engine cars produce emissions where people live, which, while doesn't change a lot in terms of global warming, which impact whole planet and depend on emissions on whole planet, this does impact public health in a locality where the car is used. And here is a graph splitting between cars and trucks from UCS panel. Again, over 50% lifetime reduction and meaningful savings over whole vehicle lifetime. And just for completeness, here is data comparing several countries from ICCT panel, the International Council of Clean Transportation. Take note, not directly comparable to previous bars since units are not the same. When using American resources, we are calculating grams of CO2 equivalent per mile. Now it's international source, so it's grams per kilometer. Kilometer is slightly less than a mile, so numbers are slightly lower across the board, but the global trend seems to be confirmed. But we see an interesting detail. Since our grid is cleaner than Chinese or Indian, benefits of using an electric car in America is actually way more pronounced than in China or India. And Europe also seems to be doing quite better than China or India. So another area is toxic pollutants, because while the primary focus of this video is climate and climate change, I can also note that there are other pollutants such as nitrogen oxide, carbon monoxide, and other, which are toxic and are also being cut to zero with EVs. And even if this is not so directly tied to climate change as CO2, there is a very adverse health effect on all of us. And well, this is another area where EV can bring benefit to society, but unfortunately, that's not the case with particulate matter. That's another area of vehicle-related pollution. Because while, of course, there is particle pollution from tailpipe and EVs don't have this, there is also a very significant particle pollution from tire wear. And that's the area where EVs are actually meaningfully worse than gas cars because due to their quick 0 to 60 acceleration and quite a bit heavier weight, they wear out their tires at faster pace, so they may lead to even more particle pollution and microplastics. So that's another thing to be aware of. So what's the public health impact? Well, in addition to measurable reduction in greenhouse gases, the recent study from Keck School of Medicine reported direct link between transition from gas cars to electric cars and lower level of respiratory diseases, including asthma, because fewer overall pollutants related to driving EVs compared to driving gas cars. So while research in this area is relatively new, the results are quite promising. So it's safe to say that while electric cars aren't exactly clean, they are definitely cleaner than gas cars. Not clean, but cleaner. Just like skin cancer is less deadly than pancreatic cancer. How did the regulation change over time? Before discussing if the regulation in question, the tax credit, was good, let's go deeper into how it operated. Initially, the EV tax credit was offered in exact amount of $7,500 for every electric car bought in the US, with a cap of 200,000 vehicles per manufacturer. That wasn't meant to be a permanent fixture of the system, but rather temporary incentive for them to start making electric cars. Consequently, come year 2019, Tesla and GM crossed that threshold and their eligibility for tax credit began to phase out. Next in line was Nissan, so they began to lobby to extend that tax credit for longer, lift that cap, or to do whatever is possible for them, the makers, to benefit from that tax credit for longer. Congress was reluctant to help them, but everything changed with the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 when numerical cap was lifted. But number of other rules were placed, including that the vehicles had to be assembled in US, that certain parts had to be sourced from certain countries, that the price needed to be under $55,000 for cars, but $80,000 for pickup trucks and SUVs. So, well, $60,000 car didn't qualify for the benefit, but $60,000 pickup truck did, despite pickup trucks being less efficient and more dangerous to pedestrians than cars. What the fuck? What did the Democrats smoke when they passed this utter stupidity? And, of course, individual income caps of $150,000 for single, $300,000 for married couples, but lifted for business use. Did I mention that rules for sourcing critical minerals were to be changed every year? For year 2023, 50% of battery components had to be made in North America. For 24 and 25, it was 60%, for 26, 70%, and so on up to 100%. Separate was requirement for critical minerals. In this case, it was not North America, but it was either US or a country with which we have agreement, and percentages were also different, i.e. for year 23 it was 40%, and so forth, up to, for some reason, 80%. Tables from Department of Treasury. So sometimes model qualified, sometimes it did not, and sometimes it qualified only on certain trim levels, up to the point where IRS had to create a very specific website on which of the very specific models of very specific cars could or could not qualify for an EV tax credit. Sometimes full 7,500, sometimes 4,585, 6,462, 3,501, and so on and so forth. And now it's gone. All of it gone.
It's gone. It's all gone.
What's all gone?
But did this convoluted mess of rule at least bring us to a position where we are leaders in electric car usage and manufacture? Not even close. Our numbers are lower than China, lower than Europe, and even lower than global average, which includes also developing nations. All of this while our incentives were incredibly generous, at least on paper. Most European nations, if they offer subsidies for EVs, those subsidies are significantly smaller. Assume that tax credit is a form of subsidy. But while our system was incredibly generous, at least on paper, it was also incredibly convoluted, with so many small print exceptions that you had to consult a lawyer and an accountant to check which specific make, model, and year would qualify you for a subsidy, if any. So, no surprise, people avoided this whole mess altogether. And on top of that, these country of origin rules strained our diplomatic relations with our closest allies, including protests from EU, South Korea, Japan, which was followed by numerous formal disputes under the WTO, the World Trade Organization, initiated by China, alleging that our Inflation Reduction Act is in violation of international trade rules. So, what do we know of EV tax credits? Do they incentivize purchase of EVs? To a very limited extent, maybe, at expense of enormous complexity of tax code and international trade dispute, because, well, at least under a recent reform from President Biden, there were of questionable legality under international law. On top of all the practical policy problems, legal international law questions, economic problems of protectionism imposed by those credits, tax system complexity, and so on and so forth, there are several ethical problems related to EV tax credit. First concern is that we are sponsoring cars for the rich, which is also part of broader our nation's policy of subsidizing car-centric transportation for all of the nation, which benefits the rich primarily, but that's another discussion. This was brought up during Obama version of policy and partially addressed by income caps. Poor people cannot afford new cars even with tax credits, and they very often don't even pay enough income tax to make full use of tax credit, which was partially excused with original cap on quantity of vehicles, which was a policy to incentivize manufacturers, but it's bigger problem when it's meant to be permanent fixture of the tax code. And even with the income cap, there is business exception. Why are the cars for business use taxed differently than ones for personal use? Because while the Biden reform did put income caps to avoid blatantly helping the rich, there is still business exception, which means that if you use car for business, you are not subject to income caps. There is, of course, leasing loophole, where leased EVs counts as business use regardless of user's income. And of course, while very high income earners on salary, on W-2, can't artificially lower their income, business owners with similarly high income get all these write-offs for yachts and jets, so on paper they may have sub $300,000 income even if they are multimillionaires. So, well, yes, regardless how you spin it, this was subsidizing cars for the rich. And the second concern is for it being a general car incentive. Well, imagine two totally fictional characters, Joe and Fred. Joe is rather wealthy and owns 6 gas-powered automobiles. He decides to enrich his car collection with a brand new Tesla. And now he has 7 cars, including 1 electric. So 1 car for each day of the week. And still drives gas cars quite often, but he gets to benefit from green, climate-friendly tax credit. And the other guy, Fred, rides a bus. He doesn't have a car, he doesn't have a new Tesla, doesn't buy a new Tesla. His carbon footprint is actually meaningfully lower than that of Joe, but he cannot benefit from that green, climate-friendly tax credit. I guess tax credit for abandoning gas car would generate more climate benefit versus a tax credit for buying an electric car. So there is that. And then there is third consideration, which is like very important because the most generous tax credit is for buying new electric cars, $7,500. There is also tax credit for used cars, but it's meaningfully smaller and with even more strings attached. So for now, let's exclude super rich from the conversation, since there are not so many of them, and let's exclude low-income individual from the conversation, since they don't buy new cars anyway, most of the time at least. And this leaves us with the middle class. Regardless how you define middle class, let's say from half of or two-thirds of median income to double median income, that's like traditional definition of middle class. This tax credit is squarely aimed to incentivize middle class to buy new cars. In particular, new electric cars, but in general, it's about incentivizing middle class to buy new cars. At least that's the outcome if this policy works at all. If you earn middle class income, buying a new car is probably the single dumbest financial decision you can make. You're either taking on gigantic debt or burning through life-changing chunk of savings in order to acquire a depreciating asset that drags your wealth down for the next decade. Your car loses 10% of its value the moment you drive it off the dealer's lot, and half of its value is lost in less than 4 years. And since new electric cars are subsidized, few people want to buy them used, so they lose even more value at even faster rate than gas cars. This policy, if effective, literally demolishes middle-class wealth. So we have had policy that's moderately effective at its stated goal, questionable from international relations standpoint, and on top of that, squarely immoral. Let's move to second half of this video, policies for the future. Probably it's not the best time to dissect why this policy was suboptimal. Current administration is dismantling climate science left and right, punishing researchers for countering their irrational claims, actively encouraging more pollutions, promoting fossil fuels, fabricating research claiming that global warming is no longer a thing, and apparently even reversing the finding of endangerment caused by global warming. In this case, discussing how ineffectual were tax credits of the old may seem like a false equivalence or worse redirection. No, don't get me wrong. MAGA is far worse than anything we ever had since Cold War or maybe earlier, and they push so many policies far worse than dismantling electric car credits, including blocking investment in renewable powers and such. But this poses an interesting question. What to do about looming climate disaster? When someone normal gets back into the seat of power, be it a Democrat, be it a less deranged Republican, be it a third party, libertarian, green, whatever, there will be need to address a climate change. And given that we are about to lose years of potential progress in addressing climate change, likely at least 4 years, the policy plan needs to be solid, very ready, very prepared, the moment someone normal replaces Donald Trump and his fossil fuel cronies. They had their Project 2025 ready before claiming power, after all. If someone is about to reverse their stupidity, they will have to have their counterpart of Project 2025, call it Project 2029 or whatever, and have there a chapter on sensible climate policy. So, what to do if EV tax credit was suboptimal? Apart from tweaking the rules of said tax credit and addressing its dumbest quirks. First, review which states produce least amount of CO2 per capita. Wikipedia has the data. Excluding territories, the best state for lowest CO2 emissions is New York, followed by Massachusetts. Even better is DC, which is neither state nor territory and is in kind of special place, so let's not focus on it, but maybe we can. And this, by the way, disproves popular notion that producing greenhouse gases is necessary for economic prosperity, since they both have higher GDP per capita and higher median income than most polluting states. And as DC, New York, and Massachusetts are also leading nation in GDP per capita, which is quite remarkable because none of these states and territories lead the nation in EV adoption. So very certainly there are other factors at play as well. So what's so special about New York? And is it all about the state? There is also data per city. And New York City is the nation's largest city, but it's also city with lowest amount of CO2 produced per household, beating San Francisco, beating even DC. And that's New York. New York with all of its very noticeable levels of air pollution, all kinds of smoke, trash and everything. Is it really the cleanest? This notion may seem preposterous to many, including many New Yorkers. Just let's look at neon signs on Times Square, and you wouldn't think that people of Manhattan are the lowest energy consumers in the nation. But it's the case. Let's look at per zip code data from Berkeley University, and you will notice that New York City is in fact so low in emissions that it's very noticeable on the map how it's so far lower than neighboring counties and these areas. So what are they doing so well that the rest of nation can learn from? Did they all switch to electric cars? Well, no, not yet. But they seem to be doing something even better. A lot of them don't even need a car for everyday use, since they have more or less usable transit. Some of them may disagree. They will point out that their subway stations are in disrepair, their buses are often late, and so on. But they still have usable transit, at least usable. And as a result, capital of world's financial services and tech is also city with the nation's lower car ownership rate. In fact, that's the only city in US where less than 50% of household own an automobile. You simply don't need one. And even if you own one, you don't need to drive that often. And even if you drive shorter distances because everything is so close, so you produce less CO2. So, do we have an answer on what is better for climate than an electric car? Answer to that seems to be pretty clear. No car at all or car that's used less often. Reliable transit, protected bike lanes to incentivize cycling. It's all about alternatives. Am I advocating to ban or severely restrict car ownership? No, not at all. That would be an utter stupidity. In certain areas, cars are necessity of lives, or at least a very valid choice. And by the way, any politician who would advocate for banning cars would very likely be on their last term and will sink their entire political party and will, of course, deserve every electoral disaster that's ahead of them. Besides, while we can learn a lot from the city and state of New York, their situation is rather unique, and it's pointless to suggest that we can copy their patterns elsewhere, one to one, tomorrow. That's not going to happen. But we can definitely learn from them, that is. And if there is one thing that almost all political commentators agree on, the left, the right, the center, it is that we are in a huge, huge national debt. And it seems to be rising consistently. Guess what? Based on recent research data, infrastructure costs associated with supporting a car-centric transportation model are actually more costly to taxpayers than even public transit. Yes, public transit in most places is subsidized heavily. Fares don't cover all the costs. Guess what? Far more is spent on roads supporting purely automobile-based transportation. That's actually more expensive and less directly tied to user fees. And promoting automobile-based transportation also results in less efficient use of scarce and valuable space. Single line dedicated to transit can move close to 5 times as many people per hour as lane dedicated primarily to cars. And in fact, that recent bipartisan infrastructure bill championed by former President Joe Biden gave vast majority of spending focused directly and exclusively on highways, thus incentivizing even more car dependency. What's staggering is that each build-out means even more spending on maintenance. Look at this data on screen and compare it to less than $50 billion in federal gas tax revenue. So maybe the first good step for cleaner air would be less spending on incentives for car usage. And it gets even further at state level, where some states, such as Texas, dedicate over 90% of their transportation spending to highways exclusively. So, while car is a legitimate consumer choice, it's not a choice we as society want to subsidize, although we have to. And especially, it's not a choice we want to subsidize given how harmful it is to the environment. And yet, somehow, in so many areas, this is still the dominant choice or even the only viable choice. But is it really a choice if the alternatives are deliberately obstructed? Another area for easy improvement with the regulatory action is, and some state and local governments seem to be addressing it, even if slowly, is strict zoning. While no city in US will ever match New York City in its density, and even it's not really a point in trying, a lot of them keep majority of their developable land under very strict zoning regulation, which, by the way, is also the problem with New York City. It is very likely that this historically great American city is suffering structural decline because of this very reason. 40% of historic tall buildings in Manhattan could not be built today under current regulations, either because they are too tall, or because there are too many apartments, or because there are too many businesses. So even they screwed themselves up with their overregulation. And in so many areas, nothing above a detached single-family home is allowed. This is not only inefficient per se, but makes regular transit service less viable option, on top of other societal governance, utility, and so on issues as well. So people have no choice but to drive everywhere. Did you know that 81% of residential land in Seattle is zoned for detached single-family housing? Charlotte, North Carolina, 84%. Sandy Springs, Georgia, 85%. Arlington, Texas, 89%. San Jose, California, whopping 94%. No surprise they have housing shortage. No surprise they have housing shortage. Modest upzoning means allowing more types of housing. It will be market-driven choice for the developers and buyers. If they want detached houses, they will get detached houses. If they want duplexes, townhomes, condos, or whatever else, let them build it. With growing land values, there will be a lot of room to grow. And abolishing strict single-family housing zoning won't mean abolishing single-family houses. Single-family houses will not go away. They will still be, and they will still be built, only now alongside more affordable options for less affluent of us. And you know what? Transit can be more viable option in dense neighborhoods with more potential riders, and even if you drive, a lot more destination will be close by, so you will be able to drive shorter distances, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Another area of harmful regulation is parking mandates. Parking mandate is actually a very common type of regulation across the country, imposed typically by local governments. This essentially means that developer or business owner is required by law to provide certain number of parking spots. And those prescriptions are very strict. 3 spots per 1,000 square feet for tattoo parlor, 2.5 for daycare center, 8 for telemarketing call center, 10 for a restaurant, 14 for a bar. This is from actual regulation from Arlington, Texas. 14 parking spots are legally required per 1,000 square feet of a bar. I wonder if they have drunk driving problem too. Do they? This not only makes construction more expensive by $10,000 to $60,000 per mandated parking spot, but also causes everything to be further apart and less walkable. So more driving and more emissions. And more emissions, but less social cohesion. Less foot traffic for local businesses, but more pollution. Happily, there is a good news. Plenty of cities are actually abolishing parking mandates. Minneapolis, San Jose, Austin, San Francisco, Portland. Interestingly, parts of New York still have parking minima. And no, abolishing parking mandates does not imply abolishing parking. Cities without parking mandates still do have parking. Only supply of parking spots is driven by market and not by regulatory requirements. Oh, by the way, did you know that even before federal infrastructure spending and federal income tax authorized under 16th Amendment, our cities still had wonderful public transit? Very often operated by for-profit companies. You used to be able to travel from Boston to Milwaukee exclusively using various overlapping streetcar networks. I guess it couldn't remain competitive once we started subsidizing automobile-centric transportation systems. And now majority of Democrats see transit as a welfare service for the poor, and Republicans as something plain evil, maybe socialist conspiracy, while most other civilized nations see it as part of essential infrastructure. By the way, in Tokyo, Japan, many rail operators are still private for-profit companies. Overregulated with mix of private and nationalized companies to be precise, but private sector is still operating large portion of rail market, both suburban rail in Tokyo and across all of Japan. So if Republicans are so very allergic to government-operated transit systems, maybe it's worth to consider creating market conditions that are favorable for private for-profit transit operators. These include cutting spending on socialist conspiracies such as, projects designed to support automobile-based transportation, with side effect of disincentivizing sprawl, cutting pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and cutting budgetary deficit on top of that. Or maybe deregulating zoning, deregulating parking requirements. But some Democrats and some Republicans seem to enjoy some of these ideas too, so maybe our future is bright once this craziness is over. Another policy mess is set of two separate sets of regulations for fossil fuel cars meant to incentivize efficiency, mainly enacted after fuel crisis. These are so-called Gas Guzzler Tax under Energy Tax Act of 1978 and Corporate Average Fuel Economy Rule under Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975. Both rules are kinda reasonable in their principle, and their purpose is somewhat overlapping, and both end up having very bad unintended consequences, as it is often with very dumb, not well-thought regulation. Gas guzzler tax is a tax on the vehicles consuming too much gasoline per mile. So if miles per gallon number is better than 22.5, there is no tax. If it's worse, tax gets progressively higher up to $7,700. Based on previous chemical formula, CO2 emissions are directly correlated to gas consumption, so incentivizing less gas consumption is good. So is it good for emission? Well, not so much. Why? Because it's levied on cars, but there is exception for pickup trucks and SUVs. Second rule is CAFE, or Corporate Average Fuel Economy. This is a tax laid directly on automakers. If your mile per gallon is on target, if you hit the target, you are good. If your average of all the vehicles you sell exceeds this number, you pay. Sounds like reasonable efficiency incentive? Guess what? There is separate target for cars, higher, and separate target for trucks, lower. Of course, SUVs are classified as trucks too. Guess the result? Since early 1980s, sales of trucks and SUVs as part of overall light vehicle market kept growing at expense of cars. Currently, for every new car in US, there are 4 trucks and SUVs, used as cars, to be honest. And what's worse for global warming than inefficient car? What's worse for global warming than inefficient car? You guessed it, an inefficient truck or inefficient SUV, which is less efficient than inefficient car. Oh, they are also worse for safety, but that's the topic for completely another episode. Maybe simplifying the rule to treat trucks, SUVs, and cars equally, even in this gas-powered realm, would be beneficial in terms of climate. This is the rare case of efficiency regulation that's making everything less efficient. Actually, two distinct separate efficiency regulations which both make everything less efficient by incentivizing bigger vehicles. Are we done with stupid regulations that ruin our climate? Well, not. Let's think about weird rules and regulations for e-bike and e-scooters. So many local police departments seem to be extra ruthless with all the e-bikes and e-scooters, and with enforcing very narrow definitions of such vehicles and where they can travel, and compliance. Just look at this. 6,000-pound machine killing 40,000 people per year? I sleep. Electric bike that's slightly quicker than average electric bike? Serious business. With plenty of unique, non-uniform regulations on what kinds of e-bikes are allowed or disallowed, under what conditions. We are creating an environment where it's legally risky for people to swap their cars for more environmentally friendly options. For what? To be harassed by overtly eager police officer? And every city and state seems to have different restrictions for this. It is incredibly hard to keep up with those rules. Legalize e-bikes, e-scooters, and all of these simple and efficient means of transportation nationwide. Give us choice. To summarize, there are many other policy proposals worth considering. What I touched was, of course, just tip of iceberg. Transportation emissions are biggest part of overall emissions, and auto emissions are biggest part of transportation emissions. But there is big room for improvement in other areas too, i.e. electricity generation. Did you know that our government gives coal, oil, and gas producers $34.8 billion per year? In 2017, it was mere 14.7 billion. And it seems to be bipartisan policy. Topic for another video. Wasting money on incentivizing pollution. So what's my final take on EV tax credit? It may be a net positive. Maybe, possibly, but it's so convoluted and so harmful in so many ways, especially in its last form, that this is a piece of climate policy I don't miss at all. And if someone wants to bring it back, better made it a tax credit on not owning a vehicle that burns fossil fuels. Someone who sells gas car to ride a bike may have a lower footprint than someone who buys an electric car in addition to already owned gas car. But prioritize deregulation and prioritize spending cuts in areas where regulations and spending incentivize emission. Allow more dense housing, allow more alternative forms of transportation, and remove all the weird incentives in favor of automotive emissions from our laws. That's a good start. Much better ideas than any convoluted tax credit. To summarize, we don't need to subsidize electric car. We need to stop subsidizing the polluting cars. And that's the end of today's episode. Let me know if you want to dig deeper into infrastructure spending policy, or power grids, fossil fuels, nuclear, renewables, electricity generation, industrial policy, safety and health implications of transit, of cars, and related topic. Let me know what you want to hear, and remember, recommend this channel to your friends. Thank you, and see you on the next episode of Publius FM.